Hey book buddies, how's it going? I'm Eric from Lonesome Reader. It's a very warm morning here in London. We seem to have skipped right from winter to summer, and I've gotten to this habit recently where I seem to be waking up really early in the morning, so like around 6 a.m. and I just start reading, and it's been really nice actually. It's like, you know, that sort of habit you form if you start waking up at a certain time. You just always start waking up at that time, and I really like this sort of quiet time in the morning when I can just read for a few hours before going to work. So hopefully that'll keep up and I won't tire myself out. But I've been really enjoying reading the long list for the Women's Prize for Fiction, and I'm almost finished. I'm very close to finishing the list, and I'm getting sort of excited because I've really enjoyed doing it, but I've been getting antsy wanting to read other things as well. And so today I want to talk about some of the books that I'm really excited to get to, and so I have a whole big group of books here that I want to talk about. And these are all books which publishers have kindly sent me, and I've picked out the ones that I think sound really interesting. They're all being published for the first time in this month in April. And so I'm going to get right in, giving a little summary of them and why I'm so interested and excited to read them. First up, I've got a new Everyman's Library edition of some writing by Angela Carter. It has her novel Wise Children, and also two collections of short stories, The Bloody Chamber and Fireworks. And she wrote Wise Children. That was her last novel, which was published in the 90s, shortly before she died. She died of cancer. And Angela Carter, if you don't know, was this wonderful writer of fiction. She's mainly known for sort of reinventing fairy tales and giving new sort of feminist versions of these fairy tales. And her writing is always rich with imagination, so it's like very fun and engaging to read, but also very thoughtful as well. So yeah, I'm really eager to revisit some of her writing. I read her novel Wise Children a number of years ago. It's about two vaudeville sisters and sort of the story of their lives. It starts with them as when they're old women. And then some of the short stories in this, The Bloody Chamber, are these sort of retelling of classic fairy tales. And a very cool cover with Angela Carter on the cover. Next up is a new novel that has been given a lot of controversy this week. That is Ponti by Sharlene Teo. This is her debut novel, and it's the story told from the perspectives of three different women over a number of decades. And I think it charts the story of these two girls' friendship, and then it involves a remake of a sort of cult film, and the story is sort of about that, and it summarizes it as it is at once an astounding portrayal of the gaping loneliness of teenagehood and a vivid exploration of how tragedy can make monsters of us, which is a really good description. But why it's been getting so much controversy sort of is because it was reviewed in The Guardian by Julie Meyerson, and she gave it quite a savage review and was quite critical of it, saying this is quite obviously a novel that's come sort of out of a creative writing class, which I think is always quite like a cutting, I don't know if that's like a very good argument against new fiction. But there have been lots of like responses on Twitter by authors and critics who are saying that this is really unfair to cut down a debut novel like this, which you could argue is or isn't the case, but I'm eager to read this novel and find out for myself. The Dictionary of Animal Languages by Heidi Sopinka. This is a proof copy, but this is the finished copy of the novel. And so I'm really interested to read this. This novel is sort of a fictionalization of the life of Leona Carrington, who last year, she was like an artist, a painter and a writer who experienced a bit of a resurgence last year when it was her centenary, because there was a new biography printed about her and some of her fiction was republished. And there was sort of this wave of resurgence of interest in her, and I wanted to ride that wave, but I didn't quite get on it. I didn't get it together to like read any of these new books that were coming out. But she had such an interesting life. She was friends with a lot of the surrealists in the early 20th century and just seems like a really fascinating woman. She was born into a privileged family, and she had a number of volatile affairs and got involved with all of these artists, and then like sort of lived as like a recluse in Mexico, I think, for a number of years. So this sounds like a really fun and like interesting novel. Next is a book of short stories called Shift by Mia Gallagher, and Mia Gallagher is an Irish novelist who I feel like she's a writer that hasn't really burst out of Ireland yet. She's not much known outside of the country. This is published by New Island Books, who are an Irish press. And this is her first book of short stories. And I think it's sort of an evocation of a city and the different lives of people in a city. And I keep meaning to read more books of short stories, so this is a book that I really want to get to. Next is a really experimental sounding book called The Chameleon by Samuel Fisher. And this is the story of a novel, a book, that has existed for 800 years. And so it sort of follows the path of this book over the centuries, telling the story of the different lives of people who have come into contact with it, which sounds like a really intriguing premise, and I'm not really sure how he pulls it off. But it's interesting because this writer is also like an editor and publisher at this small experimental press. And it has a quote on it from Ellie Williams, who's written a book of short stories that was really well regarded recently as this great experimental book of short stories. So yeah, this sounds like a really intriguing, unusual book. Next is a novel which sounds almost like on similar kinds of lines, and that's The Overstory by Richard Powers. Again, this is a proof copy, so this is what the finished cover looks like. And Richard Powers is an author that I've always sort of meant to read. Like he's like published a number of books over the years, and he's won the National Book Award, and he's very well regarded in some ways, but then I've heard from some people who've read him that he's like quite pretentious. And so this novel sounds very interesting. In a similar way, it follows the life of a tree or trees and the people who come in contact with these trees over a number of years. And so it's sort of a different way of telling a story and the lives of different people over a long period of time, but focusing on one kind of object. And so I think it's sort of steering the focus away from the very self-centered lives of these people to a tree which just like exists in solitude for like a very long period of time. It sort of sounds like something that like Ali Smith would do. The Third Reel by S.J. Naude, and this is a South African writer who I read his book of short stories called The Alphabet of Birds, which was really beautiful, really excellent book. And this is a novel which is about someone who moves from South Africa, who becomes like, I think to avoid conscription into the South African army, moves to England to study and discovers there a first reel of this film which has been lost and forgotten. And it was created in Germany during World War II. And so then he travels to Germany to try to discover the other reels of this forgotten and lost film. And I think that sounds like a really intriguing story, and he writes really interestingly about displacement and how the place where we live, the place where we grew up in, doesn't necessarily reflect our inherent natural values, and about sort of traveling and trying to discover an identity outside of the place where we were born. And sort of this sounds very much like that kind of story that he builds off from his debut book of short stories, in terms of sort of like moving around and trying to discover yourself. Things Bright and Beautiful by Anbara Salam. This is about a woman who travels with her preacher husband to a South Pacific island that's very remote, and about how she's very nervous about this move because it's obviously a very different way of life from what she's used to, and about how they sort of adapt and deal in this new environment, and how her preacher husband sort of breaks down and isn't able to cope here, where she starts to thrive. So that sounds like a really good, intriguing story. Territory of Light by Yuko Tsushima. And this is a Japanese novel which has just been translated into English for the first time, even though it was written in 1979, I think. And it's interesting because it was published in first published in serial form over, I think, 12 months in sort of following the seasons. And it's the story of a woman who has a child and then is abandoned by her husband, and she moves to Tokyo to try to make a new life for herself and her child. And she moves into this apartment that has lots of light coming into it, but at the same time her inner life is becoming very dark. It's meant to be a beautiful classic Japanese novel that's in English for the very first time. And next I have some non-fiction, which I don't often read all that much non-fiction, but these books sound really intriguing and good. And the first is a book of essays or memoirist essays called She Called Me Woman, where Nigeria's queer women speak. And this is published by Cassava Press, which publishes a lot of African fiction in the UK. And this sounds so intriguing and good because you don't often get stories of gay life coming out of Nigeria because it's a very religious country. Large sections of it are still very homophobic. And so it feels really important that these women are finally being given a voice to tell their own stories. And I'm sure they've got something to say. The Little Virtues by Natalia Ginzburg. These are essays by this Italian writer who wrote them between 1944 and 1960, I think. And they recount her experiences of living in Italy under fascism. A lot of them reflect on politics, and then others sort of are about feminism. And she has fans in like Maggie Nelson and Zadie Smith. So it sounds like a really intriguing writer being brought into English. And I think a number of her books are being published in English for the first time. Skybound by Rebecca Loncraine. This is a memoir by a woman who is suffering from cancer and sort of facing her own mortality. She took the decision to take up gliding, and so she learned how to fly through the air with no engine, just gliding through the air. And it's her reflections on life and mortality. And like sadly, in the course of writing this book and before its publication, she became ill with cancer again and sadly died. So this is being published posthumously. To Throw Away Unopened by Viv Albertine. This is a memoir by a former musician. She was in this punk band called The Slits. And this is a memoir where she sort of excavates her family life and tries to uncover these secrets and things that were hidden to discuss them and bring them out into the open. My friend Naomi read this and said it was brilliant. So yeah, I'm really intrigued to get to this. And finally is a novel that I ordered myself from America because it hasn't been published in the UK. I don't think it's going to be published in the UK. It's Patrick Nathan's debut novel called Some Hell. My friend Greg read this and said it was great. And I was also really intrigued to read his writing because Patrick Nathan and I have like followed each other on Twitter for a long time. He has lots of interesting, fun thoughts about books. And I've read some of his short fiction before, which I thought was really excellent. And so this novel is about a family dealing with the aftermath of the father commits suicide and then coming to terms with that and trying to understand how to progress forward. It sounds like a really excellent novel, and it comes with a blurb on the front by Gerard Conley, who wrote this memoir called Boy Erased, this really powerful memoir about a boy whose family forced him to go to this Christian institution that tried to convert him and stop him being a gay man. So those are new books that I'm really excited about and that I'm looking forward to. Let me know in the comments below which you think sound really intriguing, and let me know what you've been reading. I'm sure I'm going to come back soon with thoughts about the Women's Prize long list and what might make the shortlist. I hope you're doing well, and I'll speak to you again soon. Happy reading, everyone.